Imagine dedicating your entire life to catching your children every single time they fall, only to reach out for their hand in your darkest moment and find nothing but empty air. This is the heartbreaking true story of a devoted mother who gave her family absolutely everything, only to be cast aside the moment she became an inconvenience. But her entitled children had no idea that the very woman they coldly abandoned in the dirt was about to pick herself up and teach them a devastating, million-dollar lesson about what happens when you mistake a mother's unconditional love for endless weakness. Let me introduce you to Joyce. She is a 72-year-old widow living in Ohio who always assumed the brittle winter wind would be the thing that finally took her down. Instead, Joyce spent her entire life as the ultimate safety net for her family. When her husband Frank passed away, she was left to carry the heavy emotional and financial weight of supporting their two children, Evan and Rachel. And carry it she did, without a single ledger sheet or complaint. When Evan broke his collarbone falling off his bicycle as a child, Joyce held him all the way to the hospital, promising everything would be okay. When Rachel went into early labor, Joyce hastily packed her hospital bag, drove her straight to the ER, and held her hand through every agonizing contraction. Her generosity didn't stop in their childhood. She used the very last of Frank's life insurance money to fund Evan's little coffee shop, and she quietly wired money to Rachel whenever she called in tears over her mortgage. Joyce was immensely proud to be the person they called first to fix their broken lives. But the universe has a cruel way of testing our safety nets. One soft, cloudy spring morning, Joyce put on her old gardening gloves to prune her thirsty, drooping roses, a quiet ritual she had maintained every year since Frank passed. The air was just warm enough to make her sweat beneath her cardigan as she crouched near the trellis. Suddenly, her foot slipped on a slick, treacherous patch of damp mud. Her legs folded beneath her in a sickening, unnatural way, followed by a loud, wet crack. Joyce jolted sideways and hit the ground hard, her cheek pressed into the damp earth before she could even cry out. Pain immediately flared up her side and radiated intensely through her wrist, making her nearly black out as she struggled to breathe. As she lay there counting the ragged seconds, her heart pounding loudly, she thought of how this was exactly the kind of terrifying emergency she had always been there to help her children through. But now, when it was finally her turn to need someone, she was completely alone. Summoning every ounce of her willpower, Joyce dragged herself onto her knees, gasping in agony as her vision blurred. She crawled agonizingly across the damp grass, fighting for every inch, until she reached the porch steps and pulled herself up against the doorframe using her good hand. Dizzy and freezing cold, she pulled her phone from her pocket. She didn't want to feel like a burden, but the crashing waves of pain left her no choice. She tapped Evan's smiling contact picture, expecting her son to answer and rush to her aid. Instead, the phone rang twice before a hollow automated voice informed her that the dialed number was unavailable. Thinking she misheard, she tried again, only to get the exact same hollow message. Desperate, she called her daughter, Rachel. This time, there wasn't even a ring. Joyce was met with a cold, automated recording stating, "This caller has blocked your number." Her stomach dropped as the horrifying reality registered. Her own daughter had blocked her. Panicking, Joyce immediately tried her son-in-law's phone, but discovered he had blocked her as well. A freezing loneliness reached deep into the marrow of her bones, far colder than the Ohio wind. Stranded on her own stoop at 72 years old, too proud to call 911 and too humiliated to scream for help, Joyce clutched her phone against her chest and listened to the robins singing in the blameless blue sky. She thought of every birthday cake she had baked from scratch and every rent payment she had quietly covered for them. Finally, her neighbor, Mrs. Kent, happened to be walking her little pug, Winston, and spotted Joyce slumped against the frame. "Mrs." Kent rushed up, wide-eyed, and immediately called her son to lift Joyce into their car and drive her to urgent care. At the clinic, they set her splintered wrist in a brace and offered her pain medication. But the true tragedy struck when the nurse kindly asked if there was anyone they could call for her. Joyce opened her mouth, but absolutely no words or names came out because she realized she had no one. She used to think losing Frank was the worst moment of her life, but sitting there, she realized the truth. The real heartbreak was realizing that the children she had sacrificed everything for had decided she was no longer worth picking up the phone for. After the adrenaline faded and the urgent care clinic finally released her, Joyce returned to a house that had never felt so suffocatingly empty. She sat alone at her kitchen table, her fractured wrist encased in a stiff, uncomfortable brace, staring blankly at the dark screen of her phone. The cup of tea she had made that very morning sat entirely cold and untouched on the counter, a bitter reminder of how normally the day had started before her life fractured. When she caught her own reflection in the darkening kitchen window, she saw a weary, fragile woman she almost didn't recognize, looking older than she had ever seen herself. Losing her beloved husband Frank had once shattered her world, but the agonizing realization she faced right now was somehow even worse. It wasn't the grief of losing a spouse that hurt the most. It was the chilling, undeniable truth that the two children they had lovingly raised together had consciously decided she was no longer worth picking up the phone for. Joyce didn't even remember falling asleep that night, only jolting awake in the pitch-black darkness to find her wrist throbbing intensely and her heart feeling bruised beyond repair. She lay perfectly still, staring up at the invisible ceiling, uncontrollably cataloging every single time she had bent over backwards to make life easier for her family. She thought deeply about Evan, a boy with grand, sweeping ambitions but endless financial shortfalls, and Rachel, who could never quite keep her chaotic life in order. Neither of them had ever stopped to question why it was always their mother who silently made up the difference and absorbed their stress. When morning finally broke, Joyce awkwardly brewed her daily coffee using only one hand. She set her phone on the kitchen table and stared at it longingly, foolishly hoping the small black device might somehow apologize for the previous day's silence. It didn't ring, simply sitting there reflecting her deeply lined face in its dark screen. A desperate part of her heart wanted to pretend the horrifying events of the previous day had been a technical glitch or a bizarre misunderstanding. She tried to convince herself that perhaps Rachel had meant to block an annoying telemarketer and accidentally hit her mother's name instead. Maybe Evan's hollow voicemail was just the result of bad cellular service. But deep down in her soul, Joyce knew better. Her adult children didn't block her by accident. They blocked her because they had collectively decided she was an inconvenience. Still, guided by a mother's enduring grace, she decided to give them one final benefit of the doubt. She sat down at her computer and composed a short, strictly factual email, carefully ensuring it contained nothing that could be perceived as overly emotional. She typed, "Dear Evan and Rachel, I had a fall yesterday and was unable to reach you. I'm home now, but I have a sprained wrist. I hope all is well. Love, Mom." After reading it 3 times and wondering if it sounded too needy, she ultimately decided she didn't care and hit send. Following the email, Joyce left a carefully measured voicemail for Evan, trying with all her might to keep her voice steady. "Hi, sweetheart, just wanted to check in," she said to the machine. "I'm okay now, but I could have used a hand yesterday. Hope you're all right. Call me when you can." She left a similarly composed message for Rachel, and then she waited. The entire day stretched out in agonizing silence, broken only by the mechanical whir of her old refrigerator and the distant hum of cars passing on the street outside. At noon, she forced herself to make peanut butter toast, simply because it was the only meal she could successfully manage one-handed. At 3:00 p.m., she checked her email inbox, finding absolutely nothing. By dinner time, her heart had grown completely raw and exhausted from the sheer effort of hoping. As the sun began to set, Joyce's mind wandered back to the days when they genuinely seemed to need her. She remembered how Evan used to call her 3 times a week when he first moved out into his own apartment, and how Rachel would dramatically show up on her front porch in tears whenever she and her husband had a fight. Joyce remembered the profound pride she used to feel being the very first person they always called, the steadfast matriarch who could fix absolutely anything. But the deafening silence of the house proved that she was apparently no longer useful enough to warrant a simple response. That evening, against her better judgment, Joyce logged onto Facebook, knowing deep in her gut that she would immediately regret it. Sure enough, there they were. Evan had recently posted a glossy, high-definition photo of his family vacationing at the lake. Everyone in the picture was smiling brightly, their glasses raised in a cheerful toast. But it was the caption that felt like a physical blow to her chest. Grateful for my tribe. No drama, just love. No drama. Joyce closed her laptop so violently fast that it rattled the kitchen table. She swallowed hard against the painful burn rising in her throat, sternly telling herself she was far too old to cry over people who couldn't be bothered to care if she was lying injured in the dirt. But when the house finally went completely dark and the suffocating quiet pressed in around her, she broke down. She wept bitterly, crying for the young girl she used to be, the one who mistakenly thought being a good, strong mother meant never, ever letting anyone see how much it hurt. Joyce must have drifted into a restless sleep sitting right there in her chair, because the very next thing she knew, the pale light of dawn was bleeding softly through the curtains. Her wrist ached sharply in its medical brace, but as she opened her eyes, her heart felt fundamentally different. It was empty, perhaps, but it was an emptiness that finally left room for something else, something incredibly powerful. For decades, she had spent her life blindly believing that her children's love was unconditional. She had assumed that no matter how much they selfishly took from her, there would always be some small part of them that remembered all the long nights she had stayed up rocking them, all the scraped knees she had kissed, and all the silent sacrifices she had made without a single complaint. But in the cold light of day, she saw the undeniable truth. They didn't block her number by accident, and they didn't ignore her messages due to poor cellular service. They did it simply because they could. Somewhere along the way, her children had consciously decided that she was only as valuable as what she could physically and financially do for them. She sat in the quiet dawn and cataloged the reality of their relationship. She thought about every single time Rachel had frantically called her in tears over a looming mortgage payment, and how Joyce had immediately wired the money before her daughter could even finish asking the question. She thought about how Evan had never paid her back a single dime of the thousands of dollars she had lent him to keep his struggling coffee shop open. She had never said a harsh word or made them feel guilty about the money, because she believed loving without ledger sheets was just what good mothers do. But the harsh reality she faced now was that there is a massive, life-altering difference between truly loving someone and allowing them to completely hollow you out. Around mid-morning, the isolating silence was briefly broken when her neighbor's daughter, Chelsea, stopped by. Chelsea offered a shy smile and dropped off some groceries, gently explaining that her mother had told her about the awful fall. Joyce thanked the young woman, blinking back hot tears she had no desire to explain. After Chelsea left, a listless, heavy quiet settled around Joyce in the kitchen once more. But for the first time in her 72 years of life, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep trying. In fact, she knew she didn't. Reaching across the table, she picked up her phone and stared at Evan's smiling face on the screen one last time. With a steady, deliberate motion, she deleted his contact entirely. She then pulled up Rachel's profile and did the exact same thing. Her injured hands were shaking slightly, but as the names vanished from her device, she felt physically lighter than she had in years. That night, as the sun dipped beautifully behind the neighborhood rooflines, Joyce stood alone in her quiet house and whispered a promise out loud to no one but herself. "I'm done begging to be loved," she said to the empty room. And as the words left her lips, she knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that she meant it. The morning after Joyce deliberately deleted her children's numbers from her phone, she woke up long before dawn broke. For a few quiet minutes, she lay completely still in the dark, wondering if she would instantly regret her decision and reach for her device out of deeply ingrained habit, only to feel the familiar, agonizing sting of their silence. But instead of anxiety, a strange, profound calm washed over her. It felt as though the suffocating ache in her chest had finally settled into a quiet weight that she could actually carry. Joyce awkwardly made her morning coffee one-handed and sat at the very kitchen table where she had spent decades signing 1,000 checks and filling out countless permission slips for Evan and Rachel. For the first time in decades, she looked critically at her own life and dared to ask herself what she actually wanted without immediately factoring in who else would benefit from her choices. The question felt almost foreign and selfish, but it also felt incredibly liberating, like finally taking a deep breath after being held underwater for too long. As the hours passed, her phone did not ring a single time. No apologetic text messages arrived, and Joyce began to fully understand and accept that absolutely nothing was coming. There would be no dramatic rescue, no tearful reconciliation, and no magical moment where her entitled children would show up on her front porch holding flowers to say, "We're sorry we made you feel unimportant." The crushing reality was that they simply were not thinking of her at all. The day stretched out long and quiet as she made herself a simple bowl of soup and read a book, letting the hours fold into one another. But around dusk, she caught herself staring at a framed photograph resting on the bookshelf, a picture of Evan and Rachel beaming happily at Rachel's wedding. Her heart squeezed tightly, because even after all the blatant disrespect, a small part of her still desperately wanted to believe they were better than this, and that she hadn't unconditionally loved them all those years for nothing. But Joyce finally realized that love does not excuse everything. And it certainly does not mean you owe someone your basic dignity. With a newfound sense of purpose, Joyce rose from her chair and walked purposefully over to her old, dented metal file cabinet, the exact same one she and Frank had kept since the day they bought the house. She pulled open the heavy bottom drawer and extracted a thick manila folder labeled simply, "Estate." Inside that heavily guarded folder were her bank statements, her life insurance papers, and the official deed to her house. It held every single piece of her life's work that Evan and Rachel arrogantly assumed already belonged to them. Joyce vividly remembered the last conversation she had with Evan regarding her will. He had laughed in a warm, certain tone and casually remarked, "Well, you know, Mom, someday it'll all come back around to us." He spoke as though her entire existence was merely a holding pattern until they could eagerly inherit her assets. She had simply nodded back then because it felt easier, mistakenly believing that quietly preparing to leave everything behind for them was the ultimate act of maternal love. But as she sat at her table with those vital documents spread out before her, Joyce realized that the absolute most loving thing she could do for them now was to stop enabling their terrible behavior. She needed to stop giving them reasons to treat her like a convenient faucet they could simply turn on when they were thirsty and shut off the second they were full. The very next morning, Joyce picked up the phone and confidently called her attorney. His secretary sounded genuinely surprised to hear from her, as it had been years since she had last updated anything on file. Within minutes, Mr. Callahan got on the line, asking gently, "Margaret, how can I help you today?" Note, though her name is Joyce in this script, Mr. Callahan has always known her formally. Joyce swallowed hard, her throat dry, but her voice did not waver for a single second. "I need to make some changes," she stated clearly. "I'd like to remove my children as primary beneficiaries." Mr. Callahan paused on the other end, perhaps waiting for this grieving widow to change her mind or burst into tears. When she remained perfectly resolute, he professionally asked if she would like to designate alternates. "Yes," Joyce replied, and as the single word left her mouth, she felt a massive space crack wide open in her chest, a space she hadn't even realized was waiting to be filled. "I want the trust to go to my grandchildren, but not their parents, and not until the children are adults." Mr. Callahan remained quiet for a brief moment before respectfully stating that he understood. They quickly arranged an official appointment, and he promised to prepare all the necessary paperwork. When Joyce hung up the phone, her heartbeat finally settled into a peaceful rhythm. Her quiet rebellion had officially begun. It was not born out of spite, and it was certainly not because she wanted petty revenge. It was simply because she wanted peace. She wanted the rest of her days on Earth to be entirely hers, rather than just a financial ledger her children assumed would someday be theirs. That afternoon, Joyce sat by the window with a fresh cup of tea and, using her one good hand, carefully wrote out two highly emotional letters she never actually planned to send, one addressed to Evan and one to Rachel. In those pages, she poured out exactly how it felt to be treated like an annoying inconvenience, and how their cold silence had spoken far more clearly than any words ever could. She wrote that she would always deeply love the sweet children they had once been, but she could no longer pretend to respect the entitled adults they had chosen to become. She didn't write these painful letters to hurt them. She wrote them so she would never forget. She wanted to ensure that if doubt ever crept back in, if she ever foolishly wondered whether she was being too harsh, she could pull out her own handwritten words and remember the undeniable truth. When the sun finally went down, Joyce neatly folded the letters and tucked them safely into the file cabinet alongside her revised estate documents. She sat there in the quiet for a long time, feeling the immense weight of the years she had spent giving without question, hosting holidays when she was too exhausted to stand, and making countless sacrifices, believing that if she just kept showing up, they would eventually see her. But they never did, not until she finally decided to disappear. That night, Joyce slept better than she had in years. She didn't dream about Evan or Rachel, and she didn't wake up desperately reaching for her phone. She just rested, finally and mercifully, without a single apology. 3 weeks passed without a single word from her children, and the profound silence eventually became its own comforting kind of company. Joyce slowly learned how to fill the empty hours without anxiously checking her phone every time it buzzed. She went back to tending her beloved roses, taking special care not to overreach with her still-healing wrist. She cooked simple meals, read old novels, and let the house remain as perfectly quiet as it wanted to be. Some days, a cold loneliness would creep in like a draft under the front door, but she constantly reminded herself that she had survived far worse in her life, including her late husband's affair and years of scraping by as a single mother. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, the silence shattered when her phone suddenly rang. An unfamiliar, but local, number flashed across the bright screen. For a fleeting moment, Joyce almost didn't answer it, but a deep maternal instinct told her she needed to hear whoever was on the other end. "Hello, Mom," a voice said. It was Evan. He sounded incredibly tired and much older than his years. A tiny flicker of guilt or longing rose up in Joyce's chest, but this time she absolutely refused to feed it. Evan exhaled a shaky breath and delivered the devastating news. Rachel's husband had been in a terrible accident the night before and was currently in the ICU. He explained that Rachel was a complete mess, and they were desperately trying to figure out how to cover the mounting medical bills. Joyce closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her collarbone, the exact place that always ached whenever her heart hurt. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said softly. Evan cleared his throat nervously and delivered the ultimate insult masquerading as a plea. "Yeah, well, we were hoping maybe you'd be able to help out just this once." It wasn't the actual request for money that made something permanently harden inside Joyce's soul. It was the sheer, breathtaking ease with which Evan asked. He spoke as if absolutely nothing had happened, acting as if his elderly mother hadn't lain agonizingly in the dirt just weeks earlier trying to reach him, and as if they hadn't maliciously shut her out to go on living their lives without a single backward glance. Joyce took a deep, fortifying breath. "Evan, when I fell and I needed help, you'd blocked me," she stated firmly. The silence that followed was so incredibly loud it felt like it might physically crack the phone line between them. "I know," Evan finally admitted, his voice shrinking into the receiver. "Rachel thought, she thought you'd been too much lately, that you'd get over it." Joyce swallowed the painful burn at the back of her throat. Too much. That is exactly what she had become to the children she sacrificed everything for, a mere obligation to be managed, and an annoying voice to mute whenever it didn't perfectly suit their lives. "I see," she whispered. "Mom, please, we need you," Evan begged. In that moment, Joyce thought of every single time she had eagerly answered that call. She thought of the night after her husband left, when Evan was just a little boy crying in her arms, and she had solemnly promised him that she would never leave and he would never have to question her love. But the hard truth she finally recognized was that love is not the same thing as sacrifice, and sacrifice is certainly not the same as self-erasure. "I'm sorry about Rachel's husband," Joyce said quietly. "Truly, I am, but I can't help you." Evan's voice immediately sharpened with panic, insisting the situation was serious. He quickly asked if her refusal was about money, offering that same old hollow promise she had heard 100 times before: "We'll pay you back." Joyce almost laughed at the predictability of it all. "It's not about money," she replied with absolute steel in her voice. "It's about respect." Before Evan could offer another pathetic protest or flimsy excuse, Joyce pressed the button to end the call, setting the phone down on the table as her hands violently trembled. Exactly a half hour later, Rachel showed up unannounced on her front porch. She didn't even knock at first. She just stood there with her arms folded defensively and her eyes red from crying, until she finally rapped her knuckles aggressively against the glass pane. Joyce opened the front door, but she deliberately did not invite her daughter inside. "Mom, are you really going to do this?" Rachel demanded, her voice cracking with indignation. "You're punishing us when we're already hurting." Joyce looked closely at her daughter, the baby she had rocked to sleep so many nights, and the young woman she had unconditionally supported through every single bad decision. For the very first time, she saw Rachel not as her helpless child, but as a fully grown adult who had made her own toxic choices. "No," Joyce said calmly. "I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself." Rachel flinched violently as if she had been physically slapped. "After everything we've done for you," Rachel hissed venomously. That incredibly arrogant statement caused whatever tiny, lingering shred of hope inside Joyce to finally break. "After everything you've done." Joyce's voice was soft, but it carried a razor-sharp edge she had never allowed herself to use before. "Rachel, when did you last call me just to ask how I was? When did you last thank me for any of it?" Rachel immediately looked away, her jaw tightening as she realized she had absolutely no defense. "I'm sorry about your husband," Joyce repeated one last time, "but I can't be the person you only remember when you need something." Rachel opened her mouth to argue, closed it again, and for a fleeting second, Joyce saw a tiny flicker of regret cross her daughter's face. But true to her entitled nature, Rachel simply turned around and walked down the porch steps without saying another word. Joyce stood there watching her go, her hand resting firmly on the doorframe. Her heart ached terribly, but she knew with every fiber of her being that this was the only way forward. The final straw had been definitively laid across her back, and she absolutely refused to carry their crushing weight anymore. Joyce closed the heavy front door and securely locked it behind her daughter. As the quiet settled back into her empty house and over her silent phone, she didn't feel a single ounce of shame. For the very first time in her life, she truly felt free. The days immediately after Rachel left were profoundly quiet in that specific way only an old, empty house can be. Joyce filled her long hours with small, grounding tasks, folding laundry, carefully trimming her rose bushes, and organizing old photo albums, to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering. On the 5th day, she broke her own promise and checked her phone, finding absolutely nothing from her children, just a handful of grocery coupons and a library email. She set the phone face down, whispering to the empty room that she was finally done. But the very next morning, Joyce opened the front door to get the paper and nearly stepped on a pale blue envelope resting on the doormat. Her name was written across it in wobbly, careful print. It was from her 10-year-old granddaughter, Lily. Sitting at her kitchen table, Joyce peeled it open to find a single sheet of lined notebook paper decorated with a tiny heart sticker. The letter broke her heart and healed it all at once. "Dear Grandma, Mom and Dad are really mad at you. They keep saying you don't care about us anymore, but I don't think that's true. I miss you a lot. Can I still come see you?" Vision completely blurred with tears, Joyce immediately picked up the phone and dialed Rachel's house, fully expecting it to go to voicemail. Instead, Lily answered after 2 rings, speaking in a hushed whisper as if she knew she was doing something forbidden. Joyce's voice cracked as she thanked the little girl for her letter and promised her she could come over absolutely any time. They eagerly made plans for her to visit that coming Saturday. Joyce spent the next 2 days joyfully preparing the house, washing the guest sheets and stocking the kitchen with all of Lily's favorite snacks: strawberry yogurt, graham crackers, little cartons of chocolate milk, and a fresh batch of oatmeal cookies with raisins. When Saturday morning arrived, Rachel's husband's car pulled up to the curb, and Lily got out alone carrying a little pink overnight bag. The second the 10-year-old reached the porch, she threw her arms around Joyce and mumbled into her shoulder, "I knew you still loved me." For those precious hours, it was just the two of them, baking, playing board games, and sitting in the garden without a single ounce of bitterness or judgment. The following morning, after eating a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast together, Lily turned to her grandmother before leaving and said very seriously, "I don't care what Mom and Dad say. I'm going to keep coming to see you." As Joyce watched the car drive away, the house felt quiet again, but this time it wasn't a lonely, accusing quiet. It felt like a peaceful space she could finally fill with something better than regret. Knowing exactly what she needed to do, Joyce called Mr. Callahan to confirm that all the paperwork, the revised will, the trust for the grandchildren, and the permanent removal of Evan and Rachel as beneficiaries, was officially in order. Her attorney gently noted that she sounded much lighter, and Joyce confidently smiled, replying, "I am." The following Saturday, Joyce decided to do something she hadn't done for herself in years. She hosted a beautiful backyard dinner party. She arranged mismatched chairs under the maple tree her late husband Frank had planted, strung up soft white lights, and invited the true friends who saw her as more than an obligation. Mrs. Kent brought deviled eggs, her old coworker Carol brought peach cobbler, and even Mr. Callahan and his wife stopped by to celebrate. Sitting around the table telling stories and laughing, Carol reached across, took Joyce's hand, and softly told her that she truly deserved all of this. Later that night, long after the dishes were washed and the guests had gone home, Joyce sat entirely alone under the warm string lights. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text message from Evan that read, "Mom, we really need to talk about what you've done. It's not fair to the family." Once upon a time, Joyce would have rushed to explain herself, apologize, and carry the heavy burden of their disappointment. But not anymore. She stared at the words, set the phone face down, and took a long, peaceful sip of her tea. She realized she hadn't lost her family. She had only lost the toxic illusion that they actually valued her. She looked up at the deep, endless sky and smiled, deciding to let them call her selfish and gossip about the inheritance they always assumed would be theirs. She was entirely done proving her worth, and when she finally stood to go inside, she didn't look back once. The valuable lesson for the listener. Joyce's powerful story is a vital reminder that a mother's love is unconditional, but her financial and emotional access should never be. Key takeaways to remember. Love is not self-erasure. You can deeply love your children without letting them hollow you out. Being a supportive parent does not mean you are required to act as a permanent, silent safety net for adults who refuse to respect you. Boundaries reveal true intentions. When you stop providing endless favors, money, or convenience, the people who only loved your utility will expose themselves by getting angry rather than showing concern. You owe no one your dignity. Even after decades of sacrifice, you retain the absolute right to protect your peace, your legacy, and your assets. True family is defined by genuine connection and respect, not by those who treat you like an obligation to be managed.